Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second of our webinars exploring the work of the Flourishing Floodplains project. And welcome back if you joined us for our first webinar on ponds and eels. My name's Sue and I'm the engagement officer for the project. And before we get started, I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to the project. Apologies if you heard this already before, if you came to the first ones, but just for those people who are joining us today. So Flourishing Floodplains is a joint project, and we've been running this with the Floodplain Meadow Partnership run by the OU and the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group Southwest. Our funding has come from the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, so many thanks for that. The project itself is focused on the Severn and Avon Vales, and our vision is one where bigger, better and more connected wetlands provide a haven for wildlife and help connect people with nature. To do this, we've been working to restore floodplain habitats in the farmed landscape so that they boost biodiversity, store carbon and improve soil and water quality and help prevent flooding. I also want to take this opportunity to say a big thank you to all the farmers, landowners, community groups and volunteers who've taken part in the project. It certainly wouldn't have been possible without all their support. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the work we've been doing on our floodplain meadows and their restoration. And presenting will be Emma, Caroline and Claire from the Floodplain Meadow Partnership and Sarah and Debbie from FWAG. So thank you all for making time to do this. Really appreciated it. If you want to ask questions of our speakers, there should be a Q&A function right at the bottom of your screen if you hover along the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, if you type in your question in there, then we'll try and answer as many as we possibly can before the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will stop talking and I'll hand over to Emma. Take it away, Emma.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Sue. Caroline is going to be operating the slides. So every period of time, I will ask her to move on. Could you move on, please, Caroline? My name is Emma Rotherow. I'm the Floodplain Meadows Partnership Manager. And as you can see, we've got a whole list of really excellent speakers this evening. I'm not going to introduce any of them. They can do that themselves. But we're going to talk about floodplain meadows in the Severn and Avon Vales. Can you move on, please, Caroline? Briefly, the Floodplain Meadows Partnership is a group based around grassland academics based at the Open University. We are steered and supported by a whole range of UK nature conservation organisations, and we're funded by a number of philanthropic organisations. But we're basically a long-term project that works in collaboration with all these organisations aimed at conserving, undertaking research and encouraging the restoration of this very rare habitat, floodplain meadows. Next slide. And I'm now going to ask you to just sit back, relax and listen for a minute while we play the Dawn Chorus at Weldrakings, which is the Yorkshire floodplain meadow in Yorkshire. I'd probably better ask Caroline to stop that now. I don't really want to because it's so lovely. You can hear the whole of that on our website, and I can supply a link later if you want to. It's a wonderful recording from it was one of the entries from our arts and crafts competition in 2021. Fabulous. But it gives you a little bit of a picture of what a floodplain meadow is. That beautiful species-rich wildflower meadow that you just saw is what they look like in June after the hay has grown up. Next slide, please. In June or July, the hay is cut and is taken away, cut, turned and baled by the farmer and taken away to be stored as this wonderful productive hay crop that can produce between 5 and 6 tonnes per hectare approximately. Next slide. Once the hay has been cut, oh, I've lost a slide. Once the hare's been cut, it's typically grazed by, can you go back? Yeah, that one. Once the hare's been cut, it's typically grazed by animals in the late summer and into the autumn until it becomes too wet for it to be appropriate for animals to be on the soil. So it's a very cyclical system. The grasses and flowers grow, they're cut, they're taken away, the animals graze, the aftermath grazing, and then we go into the winter where the land is left, and thank you, and we get floods. And it is the natural flooding that makes these systems so important. So the river silts bring in fertile sediments, which means that you don't need to have any artificial inputs or pollutants on them. And then come the spring, the floods recede, and the grass grows up again, and we start all over again. So it's a completely sustainable cyclical system. Next slide, please. The end result of this traditional management, and on some sites we know that they've been managed in the same way for 1,000 years, is this incredibly species-rich plant community. The particular plant community we've been looking at is called the Burnett Floodplain Meadow, which for the techies out there is also known as MG4. The key species are shown on the slide there, with the meadow foxtail grass on the left-hand side and the great Burnett flower on the right-hand side. Because it's so rare, it's important in a European context. It's listed as an Annex 1 habitat, and it's found typically on these well-drained soils with periodic flooding. So absolutely brilliant plant community found on floodplains in lowland England particularly. It can be so incredibly species rich. We record upwards of 40 species, 40 different species in just 1 square metre on some of the really top quality sites. However, it's extremely rare, this plant community now. In the UK, we are only aware of 1,171 hectares, but historically most lowland floodplains would have been managed in this way because of that very naturally fertile system. Next slide, please. Why have we seen such losses if it was so common? And you know, it's the same story as you know from any kind of habitat loss story, really. But I thought this slide might give you an idea of the kind of pressures on floodplains. So this is a tributary of the Thames catchment in Oxfordshire, and you can see at the top you've lost part of the floodplain to development. Further down, you've lost a lot of the floodplain in this area to gravel extraction, and all the way through, a lot of the land in the floodplain has been fertilized and reseeded. So you've got all of these pressures, and then a little bit harder to show on the slide, over drainage, flood alleviation schemes, and other competing objectives for land management mean that most of the floodplain meadows that we had have now gone. The red square in the middle there is the one remaining little tiny floodplain meadow, SSSI, in that stretch of river. Next slide, please. And finally, I shall end by sharing with you some emerging work that's coming out of the Flourishing Floodplains project, which is very exciting. We've been able to start to look at the historic distribution of floodplain meadows in the Severn Vale, and these are a couple of maps that we've got in the last couple of days, and this shows you 2 areas of the Vale. On the left-hand side is around Cobney, and you've got the Lie just there on the bottom, and all of the area that's marked green in the early 1800s was floodplain meadow. We can see that from the old maps, and the stars show where we found floodplain meadow in our surveys from last year. So actually there's still an amount remaining in that part of the Severn Vale. On the right hand side, that's the river around Gloucester. So if you're familiar with Gloucester, you can see Alney Island in the middle, and all of the area shaded green is we believe was floodplain meadow, again in the 1800s from the tithe maps, and there's just 3 tiny remnants left now that we've picked up on our survey. So you can see that just by looking at the maps in the landscape, there's been a huge loss, but there is still some really important areas remaining. So I'm going to finish, and I hope that's given you an overview of floodplain meadows. I'm going to pass over to Claire Lawson, who's going to talk about values and benefits.
Thank you, Emma, for that lovely introduction to species-rich floodplain meadows and the history around Gloucestershire. Yes, hello everyone. My name is Claire Lawson and I'm a lecturer in ecology at the OU. And I'm going to give you a bit more of detailed background about the ecosystem services that floodplains and floodplain meadows can provide If it's a term you're familiar with, you'll know that it's the benefits that we gain from nature. And this might be a familiar sight, certainly for those of you in the area who live along the Severn. I think it's been flooding in the last fortnight or so. But floodplains are really important because they regulate that flood event. So they provide the essential space for outside the river channel for the flood water to spread out into. And we recognise this as a really valuable benefit. But as a society, we depend on floodplains for lots of other environmental goods and services. So Emma has alluded to a lot of these already. So this includes the food production, biodiversity, the store of carbon held within the soils, but also the rich cultural heritage and the history. So what I really want to get across to you is that floodplains are really important multifunctional landscapes. Next slide, please. So over the last 80 years or so, there's been this widespread transformation really of floodplains from a naturally functioning landscape to a highly modified one. Emma's outlined a lot of the improvements in terms of land drainage and flood management schemes. And this really has allowed the use of floodplains to change substantially over this period of time. So very much now they are in use for both intensive agriculture and for urban development. So these two areas have really expanded in the floodplain. So now it's thought about across England and Wales, roughly 70% of the floodplain is under intensive agricultural use. So either arable or horticultural crops or intensive grassland. And this is very compared to those natural and neutral grasslands or woodland or other semi-natural habitats. This area is much reduced. So we're getting about 3% in England of neutral grassland is remaining in the floodplain. So this change of land use within the floodplain is really important. Next slide, please. So what I really want to get across here is some of the work that we're looking at in terms of carbon and carbon storage in floodplains. We all know about carbon in woodlands and the sequestering of carbon into the wood of the trees, but also the importance of peatland in terms of the carbon store in the soil. But grasslands also have a huge stock of carbon within them. So this is just a comparison of the different carbon densities found within the different habitats that was shown on the previous slide, where we can see that the amount of carbon stored in them in terms of the mean carbon density is much higher in grassland habitats compared to certainly arable and horticulture, but also in woodland. So by changing the land use within the floodplain, we will be able to store more carbon. And what we were wanting to look at is actually how these species-rich floodplain meadows compare to this neutral grassland and the other habitats. Next slide, please. So as I said before, that we've shown that grassland soils can be effective at storing carbon long-term in the soil, but what we wanted to find out actually is how much is actually stored there. So we started by looking at some species-rich meadow sites of that, as Emma said, there aren't that many left, just 1,100 or so hectares. So we looked at some national nature reserves and we measured, took soil samples and looked at the botanical composition, but also looked at the carbon in the soils. Next slide, please. So this is just an outline of some of the preliminary values that we're getting from the lab in terms of the amount of organic carbon that is found within these 4 different species-rich meadows. So they're all national nature reserves throughout the Thames and catchment, and also Port Holme is over on the Ouse near Cambridge. And what we can see is that the amount of organic carbon stored within the top 10 centimetres is very high. So we're getting over 10% carbon, and it declines throughout the soil profile, but even below 35 to 50 centimetres depth within the soil, we're getting a large amount of organic carbon stored within the soil. Next slide, please. So how does the carbon that we have found in the species-rich grassland habitats compare to others? So here's the same data slide that I showed before, showing the carbon density that we find within the different broad habitats. Could you move on, Caroline? And then data from North Meadow Cricklade, which was one of our sites. Next, move on. What we found is that there's about 110 tonnes of carbon per hectare. So this is substantially more than the amount found in the neutral grassland. This is preliminary work, and what we've been doing in this project is collecting more data, which Caroline will go on to later. Next slide, please. So part of the reason for this is that floodplain meadows have a really well-structured soil, and it's this good soil structure which comes about through the result of the plant and root diversity. So here's just a shoots to roots diagram, and it shows the rooting structure of a lot of the different species found within floodplains. So the great burnet and the meadow foxtail, they have extremely long roots that can go down up to 2 meters. And we're thinking that this diverse root system, where you get a mix of diverse species and the occupation of the soil profile, really helps lay down the carbon within these floodplain meadow soils to quite a depth. And this is how we're getting these larger amount of carbon stores within the soil. Next slide, please. So as Emma's already said, that by looking at how the floodplain meadows are managed, the benefits that we get from them are really extensive. So hopefully I've shown to you that we have got the benefit of carbon storage and also the flood storage, but extensive grazing. They provide a sustainable, nutrient-rich winter feed, as well as the productive hay crop, which has got very low input. So it's low carbon, sustainable agriculture, but also in terms of removing nutrients and sediments. So in terms of the benefits of water quality and how they can remove up to 6 kilograms per hectare of phosphorus. So if we're thinking of the sediments being taken out of rivers, improving the water quality, removing the phosphorus, they can provide lots of benefits in terms of that. Helping improve water quality in areas. And we've been starting to look at the benefits, and on the slide there is a publication that we've been looking at, where we've been trying to look at the ecosystem services of the different floodplain meadows, and able to say actually how much in terms of monetary value they can provide to us. Next slide, please. And in terms of their biodiversity, we've just heard that lovely soundscape from Welshdray Kings and their cultural heritage. They're really important. So this is trying to emphasize really the multiple benefits that these floodplain meadows can provide. Now I'm going to pass on to Caroline to talk in more detail about the Flourishing Floodplains project.
Hi everyone, thanks Claire, that was great. I'm Caroline and I'm the project officer for the Meadows element of our Flourishing Floodplains project. I'm going to talk a little bit about the existing picture for floodplain meadows in the Vale, and also a little bit about what we've done this year through the project to add to our knowledge about that, and what we've been doing to help conserve these brilliant habitats that I hope we're making your favourite. So prior to the start of the project, we knew that of that 1,100 hectares of species-rich floodplain meadow in England and Wales, about 119 were in the Severn and Avon Vale, so that's about 10% of the national resource. So that includes several sites of special scientific interest, and a few areas that are already included on a database that Natural England hold, called the Priority Habitat Inventory. So for sort of good quality meadows qualifiers, lowland meadow priority habitat, they're then recorded on that database. So those sites are already delivering all those public goods that Emma and Claire talked about earlier. So we were hoping to sort of find if there were more, essentially. So our project aims were to work with volunteers to collect data from about 1,000 hectares of floodplain grassland to try and build up a better picture of the existing resource. So we were hoping to both find sort of unknown existing species rich meadows, but also any that were potentially suitable for restoration. So we knew that there was quite a lot of unmapped grassland in the Vale through the Gloucester Naturalists, who are a voluntary conservation group, and they've been doing quite a lot of work over the last few years, surveying from public footpaths, collecting data, and they've shown us some quite nice meadows. So we were interested in the area through their work. But the aim was to collect more quantitative data on those so that we could firstly sort of identify the nicest sites and get them included on Natural England's priority habitat inventory, and also to collect enough information that we could provide to the farmers, which if they would want to go into sort of various stewardship schemes to protect or restore these habitats, then they could. So we really wanted to collect enough data to help those farmers to protect those habitats. We also have been restoring 20 hectares in a more practical way, and there'll be more from Debbie and Sarah about that later. And alongside our botanical survey work, we've been looking to build on the existing data set that we've been working up, Claire spoke about, on soil carbon in floodplain soils. So we look to collect and analyse about 300 soil samples from different land use types, and that was ancient meadows, so SSSI meadows that have been long-standing, restored meadows, so floodplain meadows that have been restored from either arable or intensively managed grasslands, more intensively managed grasslands, and then regularly cultivated soils like arable. And we can compare and contrast the carbon storage in those and basically add to our ongoing research on that. So how do you cover 1,000 hectares in a single season? With an army of 27 willing and able volunteers, and we're very, very grateful to our lovely volunteers because they helped us no end this season. So there were 27 of them, and we trained them up to identify various floodplain meadow plant species. They came from various places. We had some Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust Habimappers. So the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust run a county-wide rolling habitat survey, and they have a huge team, about 200 volunteers who go out and do this work sort of continuously. So they've already got some botanical training, so we were very, very, very pleased to have them on board. We also had some of our Floodplain Meadows Partnership ambassadors. So we've run a scheme where we train people in botanical survey of floodplain meadow plant communities, but also hydrology and management, with the aim that those people can then support farmers in their local area. So we had a couple of them, that's Stephen there and Chris. And then through social media, we had a couple of brand new recruits as well, which was really nice. So they were complete newbies and they were really, really super keen. Yeah, and between them, our volunteers spent 240 man hours in the field and covered 107 different land parcels, which was an absolutely fantastic achievement. And that was just in June and July, so just in 8 short weeks. So we were really, really, really pleased with that effort from them. So the actual survey itself, because our volunteer botanists were from sort of different backgrounds and had different levels of experience in identifying floodplain meadow plants, we designed 2 types of survey to accommodate for that. So the idea of the survey was to cover a large area quickly whilst recording enough information for us to be able to determine the quality of grasslands, so whether it met this priority habitat criteria, and also to get the right level of information to then supply to farmers if they wanted to apply for stewardship schemes to look after those meadows or to restore them if it was suitable. So we had a simple survey which basically required the surveyors to walk through a field, stop at 5 different points and record a set list of floodplain meadow indicator species like the great bonnet or meadow sweet that you can see in the bottom there. And that basically meant that we could work out whether the grassland was high enough quality to be suitable for restoration or was already high enough quality to be considered priority habitat. And then for our more experienced botanists, they did the same survey method, but they recorded all the species in each of their 1 by 1 metre stopping points. And that included grasses and sedges and species that are generally a little bit more difficult to identify and take that bit more experience to work with. And so that level of data basically allowed us to do a few more things, like work out the actual plant community, whether it was the bonnet, foxtail, grassland, and also to look at sort of nutrient levels and fertility and things like that. So just an extra layer of data that's useful for us. So throughout the season, we've collected data from 165 places in the Vale, which is pretty good, I think. 107 fields visited this year, and then an additional 58 fields with existing data. So that came from various places like some scoping work that we did in 2020, a trial from the year before, and also some private consultancy work that we were kindly allowed to access. So that was really helpful. We managed to do 48 of the simple surveys and 59 of the detailed ones. And then of those 59 detailed surveys, 20 of them also involved collecting soil samples. So that's soil from 600 separate holes and quite a lot of lugging soil around the floodplain back to the lab, which was quite hard work. But we're hoping it's going to be worth it because it's going to add into this emerging data set about soil carbon, and we hope it will support the case for floodplain meadow restoration as a way of sequestering soil carbon. So all this work has resulted in quite a big data set. So we've got almost 650 hectares of data from floodplain grassland from surveys this year. We've analysed an extra 350 hectares from previously existing data, which gives us over 1,000 hectares just, which is just a fantastic achievement in the time. And what did we find? Well, we found that we've got 49 really good quality species rich floodplain meadows out of the 107 fields, which is pretty good. And we found that 28 of them weren't already included on Natural England's database. So that's 120 hectares that were unmapped, which is double what we already knew was there in the Vale, which is fantastic. And in addition to that, there were 47 fields which had potential for restoration as well, and that's nearly 350 hectares. So that's absolutely fantastic amount. So the picture now, before we started, we knew we had about 119 hectares of species-rich meadows in the Vale. Through the project, we've identified, the same amount again, which we will hopefully now encourage farmers into stewardship to look after if we can, and also identified almost 350 hectares which could be restored, which is fantastic, and that just shows what a huge opportunity there is in this area to restore floodplain meadows if we can, give enough support to farmers to do that. So I'm going to pass on to Sarah and Debbie now, who will talk about supporting farmers and practical restoration work that they've been doing this year.
Thank you very much, Caroline. What an amazing achievement for volunteers. So yeah, my name's Sarah Wells and I work for the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group Southwest, and I'm based in the Gloucestershire team there. So the organisation, we provide independent advice to farmers, helping to deliver change on the ground. And really importantly, we combine that understanding of farming systems and land management with our environmental advice. Next slide, please. So some of this work started in 2018. So FWAG, part of our work is looking at landscape scale. And I wanted to say a couple of words about the farmer group, the Severn Vale Guardians. So it's this farmer group that formed in 2018, and it focuses on the low-lying land in the Severn and Avon Vales, with priorities for curlew, both breeding and wintering individuals, managing of water flow through catchments, land management in the floodplain, and thinking about supporting habitat for particular species, healthy soils and natural flood management. So some of the key objectives of the group were about getting better coordinated information and support out to farmers. So that could be about the agri-environment schemes. It could be about sharing really good practice that's already happening in certain places and helping others to find out, what are the key learning lessons from that. So really a forum for farmers to share their knowledge and expertise, and looking at things like regenerative farming, habitat management and creation. Really importantly, the group's open to all land managers in the area, so very welcoming. There's sort of some very big farms in there and then much smaller, but really important, I think, that we cater for everyone managing land in the area. and WWT, the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, have been key partners providing technical input to the group. Next slide, please. So in the first year after establishing the group, we've been working with a local expert botanist, and we recognise that throughout this area of low-lying meadows, which is a priority for curlew, but there is also this huge quantity of floodplain meadow with botanical interest. And through discussions and visits, there was this feeling that there was more than what was officially perhaps recorded. So we held various events on meadows, so looking at things like the timing of hay cuts, what botanical species you might expect to find if you have a high quality sort of floodplain meadow, so helping to teach people some of the identification skills, and then talking through things like management issues, for example, invasive species that could be causing difficulties with sort of palatability for livestock or hay cutting, things like that. So really looking to link up farmers who own and manage sort of key areas of this type of habitat. Next slide, please. So really importantly, the group enabled the farmers to come together and identify opportunities and barriers to delivering sort of environmental benefits on farm and at the wider scale. And this has helped us to develop the Flourishing Floodplains project. So understanding what are the problems that need to be addressed, but also how we might be able to capitalise on some of the opportunities and what's needed to do that. So Debbie is going to speak a bit more about the work that we've delivered with some of the members of the farmer group.
Thank you, Sarah. It's really good to hear all about what FWAG does. I'm Debbie Wilkins. I work on the Flourishing Floodplains project. I am first of all a farmer in the Severn and Vale, and I have floodplain meadows. I started being a member of the Severn and Vale Guardians and started working with FWAG with my meadows, and then I've gone on to work part-time for FWAG on the Flourishing Floodplain project. And what I've mostly been working on this year is meadow restoration. Next slide, please. So we had an aim of restoring 20 hectares of floodplain meadows in the Severn Vale, because what we've heard earlier about the changes in land use, different farming practices, if they'd been lost. Next slide, please. So the plan of action was to find suitable sites in the floodplain. Because our project was only over the 1 year, we had to have the site suitable, ready to go, so no weed burden, kind of low nutrient and good drainage. So once we'd found the sites, we had different ways of improving the diversity on them. We added seeds and plants, which I'll discuss in a bit. And then we had to make sure that the land managers would carry on with management to keep them in the good condition that we were hopefully restoring them to. And hopefully with time, we got nice restored meadows. Next slide, please. So when we were identifying the sites, I think the main thing was having a willing landowner. Having the right management practices going forward was essential. Most of these were landowners that already had countryside stewardship set up on their ground, or were small areas of land that their farmer was happy to manage in the right way to support the meadow restoration. We couldn't have anything really that we had to correct conditions with because of the short time scale, so not waterlogging or high fertility, and we needed to have a suitable donor site or access depending on what method we were using. Next slide, please. So there's 3 methods of restoration that we used to improve the diversity of these meadows. So we had green hay strewing, which I'll explain in a bit, brush harvested seed, and plug planting. Next slide, please. So with green hay strewing, we are trying to add the seeds from a diverse species rich meadow to a meadow that hasn't got that diversity. You can't really buy off the shelf the seeds that you need for these meadows, and you want them to be local to the area. And so one of the methods of doing this is green hay strewing. So you take a meadow and you cut it as like you were cutting for hay, timing it so that it's the right time. So the seed wants to be almost ripe, but not completely ripe, because you don't want it to completely shatter as you cut the hay and lose the seed. So timing is very important. You cut the grass, you row it up, and then you pick it up with your kind of modern agricultural machines. You can pick this up with a forage harvester or forage box. And then you transport it to the site where you want to do the restoration. It's important that this all happens quickly. So within a couple of hours of it being cut, it's at the new site and being spread. So we loaded it into muck spreaders, and then we spread it onto the fields, and then let it dry out on the fields. So the idea is all those seeds that were almost ripe, dried out, ripened and dropped their seeds, and hopefully then start to grow at some point. It was very important afterwards, well, before we spread on these fields, they were cut for hay and were scarified. So we went over them to remove any dead material in the bottom of the fields, so that there was good seed contact when the green hay was strewn. And after the green hay was strewn, we left them to dry for a while, and then the farmers introduced cattle or sheep. This was to keep the grass that was already there down, and also to kind of start treading those seeds into the ground, give them some soil contact. Next slide, please. So, like I said, you can't buy these seeds off the shelf very easily. So another way that we introduce the diversity with brush harvesting seed, this you go in a slightly more ripened stage. And so again, you need a donor meadow. And this time you wait until the seed is ripe. You go at different times of the season, depending on what species you want. So we harvested different meadows at different times. Kind of this was kind of mid to end of July. So you go in with brush harvested seed. Sorry, the picture doesn't show it very well, but it's got like little combs, and it just gently combs the seed off the top, leaving the grass standing afterwards. This is then pulled out of the machine and spread out. It has quite a lot of the leaves and the stems and the chaff in there. There's also an awful lot of grasshoppers and ladybirds and lots of other things in there. So you put it out on some sheets. Hopefully all the insects can run off, go back into the field. And then it has to be cleaned and sieved to remove as much of that chaff and anything unwanted from it. Once it's been cleaned, we can then drill it or sow it in different ways. We use some different kind of direct drills to put it on some of the ground, and some ground was just spread by hand on smaller patches. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the third way that we improved the diversity of the fields was plug planting. So seed was collected the year before and grown up into plugs by the lovely Liz Powell that you can see here. And we then took these plug plants to the meadows and using volunteers, made little holes, put plugs in and sealed them up. It's harder to do a big meadow this way, but smaller meadows, and you can improve the diversity this way in small patches, and hopefully that will spread out over time. Next slide, please. So this work, we managed to do the green hay on 2 sites of 20.2 hectares in total. We covered with green hay. We had brush harvested seed from 4 sites, a total of 128.5 kilos of seed. So that last half kilo is very important because it's hard to harvest and very precious stuff. We spread that over 17.6 hectares on 5 different sites. There's a variety of different sites that we've used the brush harvested seed. Some of that has been kind of whole meadows that we've done green hay on, just to add some more diversity. Some has been areas where scrape or pond work has been taken place, and so bare soil's been made, and we wanted to put kind of a good seed mix back on there. And then we planted 6,400 plugs, which was a lot of hard work by the volunteers, so well done them. Over have 16 different species there over 5 sites. And I think that's me finished. Thank you very much. Oh.
Thank you very much, Debbie. That's a fantastic summary, everybody, of all the different things that we have tried to do, and hopefully a flavour of the sort of things that we're finding out about the Vale. And it turns out that it is really a rather special place for floodplain meadows. So what is the future for floodplain meadows? I mean, nationally, we want to see recognition of their rarity, and to really hammer home their value in a policy sense, particularly offering up their value as having a role to play in climate mitigation and carbon storage, of course. We want them prioritised for restoration through farm support and local projects for all of the reasons that we've outlined. And we'd really like to see a wider understanding of their high value sustainable food production amongst the wider public, that the message is around eat better but eat less meat, and when you can help to create these kind of habitats is a really important one that we'd like to promote. And of course, we want to take this project further forwards in the Severn Vale, the Flourishing Floodplains work. So obviously, we're going to start looking at whether there's opportunities for more restoration, whether we can widen out the farmer group that we've got, and whether we can develop these community projects that Deb has just been talking about as well. So hopefully lots going on, hopefully lots of future positive stories to tell. And that's it, that's us. So please ask your questions. I'll hand back to Sue to help manage the discussion session, and thank you very much for your time.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, all of you. It's a really interesting stuff there, and amazing work that's been done. And I have to say, I was one of the volunteers that helped with all the plug planting, so I'm glad to have done my little bit. I've had some questions come in, so I will just read them out, and if you feel that it's appropriate for you to answer them, please feel to do so. So the first one really is more of, I think, of a plea for help. It's from Steve. He's got an acre of farmland in Cambridge, just up the road from us in Slimbridge, and he wants to plant a wildflower meadow. It's in a floodplain, but not so near the road for Severn. So he'd really appreciate if maybe one of you guys could email him and provide some help. So I will pass on your details, Steve, to the girl, I should say the ladies in Floodplain Meadow Partnership and to FWAG, and hopefully they will be able to get back to you and provide some information and some help. So question is, so how long would it take for the improved grassland to revert to flood meadows? Who would like to take that one?
I can start, Sue, but some of the others might want to butt in. It's a slightly tricky question to answer because it does depend on what your starting point is, and obviously you've asked about improved grassland, so we can assume it's probably quite nutrient rich. So the objective in the beginning would be to reduce the nutrients, and generally the best way to do that is to keep taking a hay crop and removing all of the hay from the site, and over a period of a number of years, maybe 2 or 3, that should bring your your soil nutrients down to a level where it would be worth introducing seeds. But the thing to do first is to find out what your soil phosphorus level is by having a basic soil analysis done. And once you've got that information, then you can make a decision from there. But in terms of going from an improved grassland to one of the ancient meadows that we've shown you, that's a really long-term project. That doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't even happen in 5 years. There's been some research which suggests that even after 100 years, you don't have the complexity of the ecosystem. But within 5 years, and certainly within 10 years, I would expect you to be seeing most of the main species. They just won't be in that very interwoven tapestry of a very even distribution of species. So you have to understand that it's a long-term project. It's not going to happen overnight. But it should just keep getting better year on year if you can keep taking that hay cut, keep removing the hay, and keep getting your kind of cycle of management. Does anyone else want to add to that?
I take that as a no. So I'll pop on to the next question. So for the surveys to determine habitat quality and presence of indicated species, why were there only 5 stopping points, and who decided where to survey, or were they random points? That's probably one for Caroline, I feel.
Yeah, I can do that one. So we had a discussion with Natural England at the outset of the project. So one of our objectives was to try and cover as much of the area as we could in a short season. So we came to the agreement that 5 stopping points was kind of the optimum to balance speed and efficiency against sort of data collected, really. It's been quite good actually, because it means we can sort of cover sort of 2 to 3 fields per surveyor per day, which has allowed us to cover that 1,000 hectares. In terms of where we decided to survey, I'm not sure if you mean within the field or which field, so I'll do both. Within the field, the surveyors were basically asked to try and stick within homogeneous stands of vegetation. So basically not to stick to the edges and not to plonk it in sort of a patch that was obviously different from the rest of the vegetation. So the idea was to try and get representative samples in a fairly structured way, so if you've got a huge great patch of weeds or a big patch of bare ground, then to avoid that. But generally in meadows that are managed for hay, they tend to be fairly even in their sort of structure anyway. In terms of which fields we decided to survey overall, we had a fairly large scoping exercise from the data that the Gloucester Naturalists had collected. So they've been surveying from public rights of way and making contact with various farmers. So we sort of had an idea of where the better quality, sort of medium to high quality meadows were, and we were able to scope out the sort of really highly intensive grasslands, so we weren't wasting time kind of going and surveying them. So yeah, that's hope that answers your question.
Lovely, thanks Caroline. So another question is, do you have any resources or advice for key indicator species and learning how to identify these? Who'd like to take that one? I guess a Floodplain Meadow Partnership, maybe?
I can, yeah. We are just in the middle of updating our website, but when it is online, which should hopefully be very soon, there'll be some identification resources on there. And I would always advise people to get yourself a nice botanical field key and go out and have a picnic and just look at things out in the field. That's the way to learn. A nice starter one is Francis Rose's wildflower key. Or the Field Studies Council do some nice pull-out charts, one of which is species of floodplain meadows, which you can get for I think about £3 or £4, so really good value. Or we've got a Facebook, we've got an Instagram. If you want to ping us a photo, we can always, or Twitter. So get in touch with us that way. But yeah, my favourite is to go and make friends with the botanist and give them some cake and take them out into a meadow and look at stuff. That's the best way to learn, I think.
Sounds a great idea. We should all do that. So great. I think I'll stay with you, Karen. Actually, you talked about the 349 hectares of species poor meadow that we have. How long do you think it would take to restore that to a more species rich meadow?
I think we've probably covered that already, but it really depends on site specific. So it'll depend on soil fertility and various, whether there's a weed burden, what the phosphorus levels are, what the drainage situation is. So, I mean, I think you can get decent results in 5 years, but as Emma said, to get the really species rich stuff, it's decade. You're looking at several decades, but to get them into a better condition to be providing some of those ecosystem services can be, a much shorter timescale. And
if we had the resources, and will you be trying to work on those hectares, or is that something that's going to for future work?
I think we hope that might be part of the project legacy, but it will obviously require funding and resources. So that's a conversation to have. But hopefully, I think through the project
coming up.
Yeah, but I think also we've been able, I hope that through the project we've been able to sort of start those relationships with local farmers as well, or improve what FWAG had already started, and hopefully that can carry on into the future and extra projects can be set up. So that's the hope, but obviously everything depends on resources.
Oh, fantastic. Sorry, go on. Yeah,
I was just going to say that FWAG is applying for continued funding to sort of develop on the farmer group as well this year. So that's something that Debbie and I have been working on the last couple of weeks. So we're still waiting to hear, but that hopefully that might come in, and that helps provide a forum for continuing some of these discussions and helping to apply for funding going forward in the future.
Fantastic. So just a couple more questions just come in. So they've got a small farm in Morton Valence. It's mainly improved grassland. So how do we get involved in project, and any advice about HLS, elms? I'm guessing that's probably one for you, Sarah or Debbie?
Yeah, so Morton Valence is very much in the Flourishing Floodplains sort of project area. So I would suggest if you get in touch with Debbie or I, we have sort of email information chains and events going on. So and up till the end of March, sort of funding available to come out and visit and provide sort of detailed on-farm sort of information. So yeah, just recommend you get in touch and sort of become part of LinkedIn to some of the work sort of and events and information sharing there, because there is a lot of information and things changing around agri-environment schemes at the moment.
Yeah.
So.
Really? Okay, so maybe we can pass on your details. That's great. So I think we've got time for maybe a couple more. So another one's just come in. She says, you mentioned the importance of good drainage so that the meadows do not become waterlogged, but also that the meadows should not become overdrained. Can you give more details on the optimum amount of drainage for a meadow to be restored? It's probably quite a tricky one, I imagine, but if someone wants to tackle that, that'd be amazing.
I'll have a go, Sue. Thank you. Yes, it's a balancing act. What you don't want is the kind of the old style IDB type drains that go down 2 meters and drain everything in sight. What you're looking for is just surface drainage of the top 10 or so centimeters of the soil. So what you might be familiar with might be the terms like gutters or foot drains. So really just spade depth type drains that just take the water out of that top layer, so that you can get the floods off more quickly. What you don't want is your meadow sitting wet for 2 weeks or more in the growing season. That would be fairly difficult for the plant community to cope with. But if your field floods and it drains within sort of 10 days or so, then that's a good indication that the soil is going to be free draining enough that you can get a decent meadow community. If you start putting in structures that will hold water levels up, and that's going to be at the surface during the growing season, then that's unlikely to be suitable for species-rich plant communities. Claire, do you want to add anything else to that? No.
Okay, so great. So I think we talked a lot about improving the biodiversity and the species richness of the floodplain meadows. Just wondering if you could give us maybe a brief overview of sort of what species we're talking about, or which species you're wanting there, maybe some of the species that we don't want to see in these restored meadows. One for Debbie or Sarah, or people who've been doing some of the restoration work?
So we want, yeah, I'm going to say it's not, I don't think there's like a particular set that we definitely want every meadow to look exactly the same. You know, they're all going to be slightly different, but there are some species that we would like to see and some that we would like not to see. So we don't want the kind of dominated by ryegrass, and some of the weed species like the reed canary grass or docks. But there are lots of key indicator like the great burnet, the lady's bedstraw, the meadow sweet, that, and the meadow foxtail grasses. So there's a whole series of things that are nice to have there, but my feeling is that every meadow is different, and you're trying to aim to get as many good things. The diversity is the important, getting that diversity. The more diverse it is, the better.
Great. So hopefully, and how long do you think? I suppose I've really, that's just my own question now, but you've really answered this, I suppose. How, of all those 3 methods that you used, Debbie, which do you think, or maybe it's too early to say, which you think was the most successful in increasing diversity, or maybe the most successful in the amount of hectares covered?
I think we won't know whether it works until we look at them next year or the years after to see what's actually coming up. But I think the green hay, we could do more area, quicker than the plug planting. You might get some of the species like great burnet, it's quite hard to germinate and grow. So once you've got it as a plug plant, hopefully you can get it into the meadow better than putting seed out there. So it depends. I think for different species it'll be different. Different methods, but I think the green hay for me was easier to do with a bigger area, but it was quite a big operation to do.
Can I add something to that, Sue?
Of course.
Can I add something to that, Sue?
Of course.
Over the last 6 years, we've looked at, I don't know, 160 or 170 floodplain meadow restoration sites across England and Wales. And we visited sites that were old pig fields or allotments or lots of improved grassland, quite a few ex-arable fields, all sorts of different starting positions, and tried to collect data about them in a standard way, and then to see if there's any kind of patterns that we could tell from talking to the farmers about what they'd done and the methods they'd used and the timings and stuff like that. And I've put a link in the chat to a paper that we published about it. But what we concluded from that seems to be that it doesn't necessarily matter what you do or how you do it, but how you manage it afterwards. So obviously you need to get the propagules in, and you need to have your nutrients in a reasonably sensible state, but actually it's the ability to be flexible afterwards with management. So each year you're looking at the weather conditions and thinking, I need to cut my hay now so that I can reduce the amount of nutrients and keep the growth down as much as possible, so it's not swamping the propagules, and is giving you a decent hay crop. And each year will be different, so it's that flexibility and the ability to kind of think on your feet about what you're doing, as much as the way that you actually did the restoration in the first place. Because we came across people that had plug planted, that had green hay, that had commercial seeded, that had dry hayed, that had slot seeded, all these different methods, and there didn't seem to be a particular pattern with any one of those in terms of a successful outcome. But the kind of the engagement of the land manager seemed to us to be really key.
Yeah, I imagine that would be very key, just to keep that continuation going. So I'm afraid we've pretty much come to the end of our time. So thank you so much, Emma, Debbie, Caroline, Sarah and Claire. They've been really, really interesting talks. Thank you so much, everybody who's been online. And just to remind you, we've got one more webinar coming up, and that's on the work we'll be doing with our curlews. That's on the Tuesday, the 28th of February, and that will be from 6 to 7. And I will obviously put the details up as soon as we've got them. So thank you so much, and hope you have a lovely evening, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.